So it doesn't make sense for Zelensky to then order all of these prisoners of war to be blown up with a HIMARS system, for God's sake. So not only are you besmirching the morale of Ukraine by killing prisoners of war who defended Mariupol, but then you're besmirching it by taking away what has become a symbol of hope for many Ukrainians in the HIMARS and using it to kill your own soldiers. It just doesn't make sense. Hello everybody, my name's Dylan Burns. Today I wanted to talk to you all about a war crime that occurred late last month. There was prisoners of war that were captured on May 16th. These were the people who were defending Azovstal that have been in Russian captivity since the fall of Azovstal, the fall of Mariupol. And 53 of those prisoners of war blew up late last month in an apparent war crime committed by the Russian military. I'm extremely confident it was committed by the Russian military, even though the Russian military denies it, and they are actually blaming the Ukrainian military. I'm going to lay out all the evidence as to why I'm confident it was the Russian military, and then you can judge that evidence for yourself. But first, let me give you the bare bones facts of what happened. In late July of 2022, a group of between 193 and 211 Ukrainian soldiers were regrouped into a new barracks in the Olenivka prison complex. This is in the occupied Donbass under Russian control, 9 miles from the Ukrainian front line. The Azovstal defenders, those captured in Mariupol, who were fighting in the Azovstal steel factory, had surrendered on May 16th under a guarantee of protection from the United Nations and the International Committee of the Red Cross. A few days later, after being regrouped into this new barracks in the prison complex, they were killed in an explosion. To be specific, 53 of the prisoners were killed, and up to 130 more were injured. There has been footage released that is extremely dark and gruesome that shows many of the bodies charred up and turned into ashes as they were blown up while they were sleeping during the nighttime. No other buildings were damaged in this strike. No Russian guards were killed during the strike, and Moscow claims that the prison was struck by a missile fired by the HIMARS rocket artillery system that was provided to Ukraine by the United States. They said this was due to the fact that these prisoners were going to squeal. They were about to admit to a bunch of war crimes either they or the Ukrainian army had committed, as well as Ukraine wants to discourage Ukrainian soldiers from surrendering to the Russian army. Russia tried to back this up by displaying fragments of a HIMARS rocket they had found. Ukraine, of course, denies this. They say, according to their intelligence, that Russia actually did this war crime using the Wagner Group, and this was to cover up abuses and torture that they had actually done to the defenders of Mariupol and Azovstal. And this was also in part to try to put a smudge on the record of the HIMARS artillery system, which has been destroying Russian logistics and killing a lot of Russian soldiers. Maybe the Americans won't be so willing to provide Ukraine with military aid and more HIMARS if the HIMARS systems are being used to kill prisoners of war that might squeal about their war crimes or might do some terrible thing or whatever reason the Russians are going to come up with for the Ukrainians killing their own prisoners of war. Now, before we get into the specifics of why I think this was almost certainly committed by the Russian Federation, I want to get one thing out of the way, that this was done deliberately. It is next to impossible for this to have been done by accident. Now, let's say you believe the Russian line here in that it was the HIMARS system. The HIMARS system, using the missile, the M31, has a GPS in it, and it uses GPS coordinating to hit its target very accurately. So it'd be very difficult for the Ukrainians to have missed, gone wildly off target, and then struck their own base. So that means that if the Ukrainians did it, it must have been deliberately, because using a HIMARS to strike one of these bases when these HIMARS are so accurate would have had to been entered in, it would have been coordinated beforehand. And if the Russians did it, well, they're in Russian captivity. They would have had to have planted explosives or fired upon their own POWs because, they have control of them. If they died, then, under their captivity and the Russians did it, it wouldn't have been on accident because they would have planted explosives or fired upon their own base. And they wouldn't fire upon their own base like that on accident. So, let's go through the evidence. As I stated before, this prison complex is actually 9 miles from the front line. So, that's pretty strange. It's strange because that's within the range of normal Ukrainian artillery. Those normal artillery guns you see in the movies that aim it upwards, the wheels on the side, you lock it in. The normal artillery guns you see, that's perfectly within range of a normal Ukrainian artillery gun. And so it doesn't make much sense that the Ukrainians would take a HIMARS system, move it out of protection, within range of the Russians, fire upon this position, opening themselves up to counterfire, and then running away. It doesn't make sense because the HIMARS is an extremely expensive system, an extremely important system that was provided to Ukraine from the United States. As of right now, there have been no confirmed kills of any HIMARS, and that's because Ukraine has been extremely careful with this rocket system. It's extremely important for its national security because it's been an amazing tool at dismantling Russian logistics and killing Russian invaders. So it wouldn't make sense for them to go out of their way to not use the local artillery they already have in the area, and we know they have artillery in the area, and instead move in the HIMARS system, and to risk the HIMARS system for almost no reason. It also doesn't make sense because a normal artillery shell costs much less than an M31 GPS-guided rocket, which is extremely accurate but extremely expensive. So it doesn't make sense when it comes to protecting the HIMARS, which is extremely valuable to the Ukrainians, and it doesn't make sense when it comes to using the M31 rocket because it's much more expensive than the artillery system and the artillery shells that would have been used if they just used what they already had in the area. Not to mention, this is much more work than's necessary. Also, if they used a local artillery system and a normal artillery gun, Soviet-era artillery, it would have been much easier to pin this on the Russians because then they could just say, hey, this was bombarded by artillery. The Russians do that all the time. They use a lot of artillery to flatten our cities, flatten our towns. This was obviously committed by the Russians. So if the Ukrainians were trying to do a false flag or something like this, they would have used local artillery because that would have made the most sense. Not dragging the HIMARS system for no reason, endangering the HIMARS system, spending more money, and leaving a lot more evidence because it's not like the Russians are using these HIMARS. Speaking of Russian evidence, they haven't really provided much to show that the HIMARS shell that they do have on site actually came from this strike. They have HIMARS shells from all over. I mean, the HIMARS have been tearing apart their ammo depots, their vehicles, their soldiers. So they have enough shells that they could have planted here, and they didn't provide any evidence when it comes to, hey, here's a big old piece of the electronics that shows that it was right here, or hey, here's a bunch of identifying numbers that could show some production stuff or anything. They didn't provide anything. No serial number, no electronics, nothing. So that's kind of strange. And I can tell you that I have, been to missile strike sites before. I was at a missile strike site that the Russians did in the Donetsk Oblast where they struck local farm homes. And I was able to actually pick up the serial number and display it and take pictures of it, which should be on screen right now. And for the hell of it, here's also some pictures of the destruction these missiles did to local civilian homes. Now here's another thing that is quite peculiar when you're looking at the Russian story. The supposed strike, only hit the barracks that the Ukrainian soldiers, the Ukrainian POWs, had just been moved to just a few days before. There was no damage to any other buildings, and no Ukrainian guards had been killed. Now, I would understand the Russians caring about Ukrainian guards and not damaging any other buildings. I wouldn't understand that for the Ukrainians. If they wanted to make it look like an accident or something else, then why would they care about not damaging other buildings? And I know the Ukrainian army certainly does not care about protecting Russian soldiers or Russian prison guards. So that doesn't really make much sense either. And when you're looking at the damage actually done to the barracks, it doesn't really line up with the HIMARS system. I'm not the only person who's brought this up. A lot of other military analysts have brought this up, weapons experts. Thomas Steiner, who's a former soldier in the Italian army, who has a lot of experience in artillery, actually made a whole thread about this, explaining how the damage on the barracks does not reflect that of a average HIMARS strike, certainly not with an M31 rocket. If this was a HIMARS strike, which is a multiple rocket launcher system, the whole building would basically be gone. Half of it at least. But the building is largely intact. You can still see a decent amount of the roof seems to be there. Like all the walls are still standing. It doesn't really make sense. The building's still largely intact. And if you go into the building, and the Russians filmed all of this and posted it online for some reason, I guess they thought that they had made a better HIMARS destruction site than they thought. All the beds that the prisoners were sleeping in when the explosion occurred were still standing upright. If this was a HIMARS strike, those beds would be strewn about, they'd be in the corners, they would be crumpled up. You would see real destruction. But that isn't what we see in these photographs. The photographs that we do see is not reflective of a HIMARS strike whatsoever. Also, immediately after the strike occurred, since the Red Cross and the United Nations do claim responsibility for these POWs after they were, they claimed responsibility right after they were turned over to the Russians. It was part of the negotiations that led to their surrender. The Red Cross did immediately ask for access to the survivors, because there were a decent amount of survivors, from the Russians, because, again, they have responsibility for this as well. They helped negotiate these prisoners being turned over into Russian captivity, and they were denied. Why they were denied? Well, you'd have to ask the Russians that. They're not being completely transparent about the fact. But now they're into kind of like negotiations behind closed doors to try to find some way that they can maybe talk to survivors and look at the site of the strike and try to determine if it was yada yada this, yada yada this. But they had denied them from talking to the prisoners. At least for now. Maybe they'll change that in the future, 2, 3, 4 weeks from now, when they can do what they need to do to make the site look right. But they denied it. And that's right after they were talking about all these prisoners wanted to squeal. All these prisoners, they were attacked by the Ukrainian army because they were just about to admit to all the war crimes. All these prisoners were about to sing like a fat lady. But now that it's actually time for the prisoners to talk, the Russians are a lot more protective of them. But not when they're dying in explosions, of course. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that a culture for these types of activities exists in the Russian army. I could point to the recent video, which I will not show on stream, and I would not recommend you all look it up if you are weak-hearted, of a Russian soldier castrating a Ukrainian POW. We also saw Aiden, one of the British volunteers who's been living in Ukraine for a very long time, so he's basically a Ukrainian, being very obviously beaten after being taken into captivity, and then they tried to dress him up like he was an Azov soldier. They put him in an Azov shirt, even though he was a Ukrainian Marine. So this type of abuse of prisoners of war is not above the Russian army. But I wanted to bring up a tweet that Russian diplomats recently made. I think it was actually 48 to 72 hours before the war crime occurred. Let me read this out loud. And again, they're talking about the same people who were imprisoned at this facility. So keep that in mind, that this is what the Russian diplomats are willing to say in public, not in private, not in some leaked phone call, but they tweeted this out on their public account. The fighters of Azov deserve to be executed, not by firing squad, but by hanging, because they aren't real soldiers. They deserve a humiliating death. Twitter reacted to this by not taking the post down, but actually by giving it a content warning and saying the only reason they didn't take it down is because this tweet might have some historical significance. looking into the future at Russian war crimes, say, like the execution of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Now, I have always been a man to say that if someone's telling you they're about to commit a crime or they're about to do a bad thing, you believe them. And if this is what the Russian diplomats were able to or willing to admit to in public, then what do you think the Russian army would be willing to do in private when nobody was looking to the same people they're talking about executing right here? And I want to bring up one more thing, and I do think that I should bring this up, but I should also give you a warning that this is from Ukrainian intelligence. This is from the SBU. So if you wanted to look at a bias when it comes to what this information is coming from, where it's coming from, etc., I do want to give that disclaimer. But there is purportedly an intercepted phone call, which you can listen to right now, that's publicly available on YouTube, that was released by Ukrainian's intelligence service, that appears to show a DPR fighter, which is the Donetsk People's Republic, Russia's proxy in Ukraine, the collaborators, a fighter for them stationed near the prison facility, talking about how they don't really believe the official line on how Ukraine attacked the facility. They actually claim that Russian Grad rocket artillery trucks were positioned about 100 meters from the fence of the prison, and they launched several volleys towards Ukrainian positions. He said that it wasn't a rocket that destroyed it, though. He insists that there were 3 explosions detonated inside the dormitory, even though there's no sound or other evidence of incoming fire. Well, there was no sound or incoming evidence of fire from, say, Ukrainian positions, but there was evidence of explosions from within the dormitory that could have only been placed there by the Russian military. He believes that the Russians planted explosions inside the prison and then they were remotely detonated. This is part of the reason why no Russian guards were killed, because if you plant this just within the prisoner of war barracks and just blow them up, well then you don't endanger the safety of any of your soldiers.
Привет. Извини, очень плохие новости. Ты слышал?
Ну, сейчас появились новости о том, что по Еленовке что-то прилетело у вас.
Это все пиздец. Они сами уебали казарму. Там было 200 человек. В общем, позавчера переселились с барака, в общем, с 3 бараков, общее количество там до 200 человек, 190 чем-то. Переселили из какого-то хуя на промзону, там типа казармы сделали. С понтом, что отсюда будут все вывозиться, и тут будут оставаться только Азов, типа пока все состав уедет, в общем, потом переселят на обычный барак. Вот. Вчера начал ночью где-то часов 11 работать град под забора, там метров 100 от забора, там было видно, и по 10 ракет. В первые 10 взрыв, во вторые 10 взрыв, в третьей, в общем, 3 взрыва пошло. Окна не повылетали нигде, характерного прихода, то есть прилета там снаряда или чего-то, свиста не было. То есть просто были такие взрывы. Вот. В общем, очень много, 200, 300, количество мы точно не знаем. Ну, в общем, это все построено для специальных целей. Выжившие есть, скорее всего, я же говорю, 200 каких-то медики, которые из госпиталя, которые тоже с нами, они там были. В общем, они сказали, парни, вас убивают. Понял. И еще было 3 выстрела с автоматом. После этого всего там был пожар, в общем, такая вот хуйня. Просто они это все подстроили сами, это очень большая вероятность. И прилетов не было. То есть, во-первых, если работала какая-нибудь батарейка, она работала через какое-то время, а не в момент именно выстрела града. Вот. И, ебать, туда, переселили людей 2 дня назад, понял, такая история.
Так они именно с градов уебали по этой казарме?
Они, скорее всего, заложили бы внутри не было прилета, я же тебе говорю.
Связь просто хуёвая, я не все слова.
Я понял. А они, скорее всего, уебали, заложили заранее взрывную.
Блять.
And if any of you out there are like, well, okay, I understand what you're saying, Dylan. I understand everything you just said. But, Dylan, would Russia really lie to us? I know the majority of my fans, when they hear that, or viewers, whatever the hell you want to call yourselves, when you hear that, you're like, okay, Dylan, we understand they do. But I just want to clarify some people who might be new about the Russian government's current tendency online about the affairs in Ukraine. They lied when they deployed soldiers into Crimea, the Little Green Men. They lied about their soldiers that were deployed in the Donbass for the last 8 years. They lied when they said they weren't going to invade Ukraine and that all of this was just a training exercise. And they lied when they said that Ukraine invaded Russia, and they showed helmet cam footage from this proposed invasion, that they were able to find this leaked footage from. But then when you geolocate the footage, it's from within Russian-occupied territory. A false flag that could be compared to what the Germans did before they invaded Poland when they dressed up in Polish uniforms and attacked a German position, which therefore justified their invasion of Poland to the German public. I can't tell you what to believe, but if you believe the Russian line on this, you're a schmuck. They have not been able to provide a single shred of evidence that ties a Ukrainian HIMARS system directly to this strike. The only thing they're banking the entirety of their assertion on is some shells of a HIMARS M31 rocket that could have been gotten from anywhere in the country. The damage on the building does not reflect that of a HIMARS strike. It wouldn't make sense for the Ukrainians to use a HIMARS system and instead use local artillery, which is already in the area. It doesn't even, and this is something I haven't talked about, it doesn't make sense from a political standpoint. Zelensky has been negotiating for the last 1 to 2 months to try to get the Azovstal prisoners back into Ukrainian-controlled territory. They want to bring them home. The Azovstal prisoners have become a symbol of, resistance, fighting against all odds, fighting in Azovstal, fighting in Mariupol, no matter how long they were surrounded, holding out much longer than anyone expected the Azovstal defenders, the defenders of Mariupol, could have lasted. Bringing them home would not only be a huge morale boost to the Ukrainian nation, who view these people very favorably, but also a huge political victory for Zelensky. So it doesn't make sense for Zelensky to then order all of these prisoners of war to be blown up with a HIMARS system, for God's sake. So not only are you besmirching the morale of Ukraine by killing prisoners of war who defended Mariupol, but then you're besmirching it by taking away what has become a symbol of hope for many Ukrainians in the HIMARS and using it to kill your own soldiers. It just doesn't make sense. No Russian soldiers dying in the strike. I mean, this is clearly nonsense. This is clearly nonsense. The Russian army executed these prisoners of war for any number of reasons. It could be because they were cruel. It could be to just intimidate the Ukrainian nation and the Ukrainian people. It could be to cover up, like the Ukrainian intelligence organizations are saying, torture of Ukrainian soldiers, which we know that Russian soldiers have conducted in, as we could see from, again, the very brutal, the very disgusting footage of a Ukrainian soldier being castrated. Or from my personal interviews with local Ukrainians in Bucha who talked about their neighbors being tortured by Russian soldiers in basements. That's going to be released very soon. That interview. Sadly, not anymore of the POWs. This was a terrible war crime that violates the Geneva Convention and all forms of international law governing warfare. I hope those who conducted this heinous act of brutality are held accountable, and I hope you don't fall victim to Russian state propaganda. I hope you all stay safe, especially a lot of my viewers which are currently in Ukraine. I hope you continue to stay vigilant to look out for this type of state-sponsored narratives that people are always trying to shove down your throat. Remember to subscribe to the channel and like so we can continue to cover the war and bring more information like this directly to you. Thank you for watching.